Chapter 9, Part 6 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalinda. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 9, Part 6. The Restoration of the Temples. It remained then for Athens to carry out that part of the programme which concerned herself, and restore in greater splendour the temples of her city and her land. We shall miss the meaning of the architectural monuments which now begin to rise under the direction and influence of Pericles, if we do not clearly grasp their historical motive, and recognize their immediate connection with the Persian War. It devolved upon the city as a religious duty to make good the injuries which the barbarian had inflicted upon the habitations of her gods, and fully to pay her debt of gratitude to heaven for the defeat of the Mede. And seeing that Athens had won her great empire through that defeat, the gods might well expect that she would perform this duty on no small scale and in no niggardly spirit. In this, above all, was the greatness of Pericles displayed, that he discerned the importance of performing it on a grand scale. He recognized that the city, by ennobling the houses of her gods, would ennoble herself, and that she could express her own might and her ideals in no worthier way than by the erection of beautiful temples. His architectural plans went farther than this, and we can see that he was influenced by the example of the Pisistratids. But the chief buildings of the Periclean age, it should always be remembered, were, like the Athenian empire itself, the direct consequence of the Persian invasion. Of the monuments which, in the course of 20 years, changed the appearance of the Acropolis, one of the first was a gigantic statue of Athena, wrought in bronze. The goddess stood near the west brow of her own hill, looking south-westward, and her helmet and the tip of her lance flashing in the sun could be seen far off at sea. But nothing was so pressing as to carry to completion the new house of the goddess, which had been begun in the days of Themistocles and never finished. The work was now resumed on the same site, and the same foundations, but it was resumed on an entirely different plan, which was drawn up by the gifted architect Ictinus. The new temple was slightly broader, but considerably shorter than it would have been if the old design had been carried out, and instead of foreign Parian marble, native Attic from the quarries of Pentelicus was employed. Callicrates, another expert architect, superintended the execution of the plan which Ictinus had conceived. It is not within our province to enter here into the architectural beauties of this perfect Dorian temple, which came afterwards to be generally known as the Parthenon. The building contained 2 rooms, between which there was no communication. The eastern room, into which one entered from the pronaos, was the temple proper, and contained the statue of the goddess. It was about 100 feet long, and was hence officially called the Hecatompeidos. The door of the small western room was on the west side of the temple. This chamber was perhaps designed for the habitation of invisible maidens who attended the maiden goddess. It is at least certain that it was called the Parthenon. It is easy to imagine how a word which designated as the room of the maidens part of the house of the maiden could soon come to be associated popularly with the whole building, and the name Parthenon came to mean for the ordinary ear, in defiance of official usage, the temple of Athena Parthenos, and not the chamber of her virgins. The goddess stood in her dwelling, majestic and smiling, her colossal figure arrayed in a golden robe, a helmet on her head, her right hand holding a golden victory, and her left resting on her shield, while the snake Erichthonius was coiled at her feet. It was a wooden statue, covered with ivory and gold, ivory for the exposed flesh, gold for the raiment, and hence called chryselephantine. It was wrought by the Athenian sculptor of genius who has given his name to the plastic art of the Periclean age, Phidias, the son of Charmides. He had already made his fame by another beautiful statue of the goddess of the city, which the outsettlers who went forth to colonize Lemnos dedicated on the Acropolis. The Lemnian Athena was wrought in bronze, and it revealed Athena to her people in the guise of their friend, while the image of the Parthenon showed her rather as their queen. Both these creations have perished, but copies have been preserved from which we can frame some far-off idea of the sculptor's work. To Phidias, too, was entrusted the task of designing and carrying out those plastic decorations which were necessary to the completion of a great temple. With the metopes of the lofty entablature, from which centaurs and giants stood out in high relief, the great master had probably little to do. But in the two pediments and on the frieze which ran around the wall of the temple within the colonnade, he left monuments of his genius and his skill, for mankind to adore. The triangle above the eastern portal was adorned with the scene of the birth of Athena, who had sprung from the head of Zeus, at the rising of the sun and the setting of the moon, and Iris the heavenly messenger was shown, going forth to carry the good news to the ends of the world. The pediment of the western end was occupied with the passage in the life of the goddess that specially appertained to Attica, her triumph on the Acropolis in her contest with her rival Poseidon for the lordship of the land. The olive which came forth from the earth by her enchantment was probably shown, and we should like to believe that at the northern and southern ends reclined the two river gods, Eridanus and Ilissus, each at the side which was nearest his own waters. The subject of the wonderful frieze which encircled the temple from end to end was the most solemn of all the ceremonies which the Athenians performed in honor of their queen. At the great Panathenaic festival every 4th year, they went up in long procession to her temple to present her with a new robe. The advance of this procession, starting from the western side, and moving simultaneously along the northern and southern sides to meet at the eastern entrance, was vividly shown on the frieze of the Parthenon. Walking along the peristyle and looking upwards, the spectator saw the Athenian knights, beautiful young men on horseback, charioteers, citizens on foot, musicians, kine, and sheep led for sacrifice, stately maidens with sacred vessels, the 9 archons of the city, all advancing to the house of Athena, where she entertains the celestials on her feast day. The high gods are seated on thrones, Zeus on one side of Athena, Hephaestus on the other, and near the goddess is a peplos, perhaps the old Peplos, in the hands of a priest. The western side of the frieze is still in its place, but the rest has been removed, the greater part to our own island. Athena Polias had now 2 houses side by side on her hill, for the old restored temple was not destroyed, nor was her old image removed from it, but in her character of victory yet another small habitation was built for her by the architect Callicrates, about the same time, on the bastion which the hill throws out on its southwestern side. Footnote: An inscription of circa 450 B.C., providing for the building of the temple and the altar, has been recently discovered. End footnote. It was an appropriate spot for the house of victory. The Athenian standing on that platform saw Salamis and Aegina near him. His eye ranged along the Argolic coast to the distant citadel of Corinth and the mountains of the Megarid, under the shadow of victory he could lose himself in reveries of memory and dreams of hope. The motive of the temple, as a memorial of the Persian war, was written clear in the frieze, whereas the sculptures of other temples of this period only alluded indirectly to that great struggle by the representation of mythical wars, such as the war of Greek and Amazons, or of Lapiths and Centaurs, or of gods and giants. On the frieze of Athena Nike a battle between the Greeks and Persians is portrayed. It is the battle of Plataea, for Greeks are shown fighting in the Persian host. But there were other shrines of other gods in Athens and Attica, which had been wrecked by the Persians, and which were now to be restored. From the west side of the Acropolis, as one looks down on the western quarter of the city, no building is so prominent, or can ever have been so prominent, as the Dorian temple of Pentelic marble which crowns the hill of Colonus, and replaced an older temple of the limestone of Piraeus. It is the temple which the sons of Hephaestus built for their sire, the god of handicraftsmen, who was always worshipped with special devotion at Athens. It is significant that on the frieze of the Parthenon he sits next to the lady of the land. This house of Hephaestus is the only Greek temple that is not a ruin. About the same time a marble temple of Poseidon rose on the extreme point of southern Attica, the promontory of Sunium. The Persian invasion had probably been fatal to the old temple of porous stone. Here the sea-god, to whom men pray at Sunium, seems to have had his own house, looking down upon his own domain. He was not forced here, as on the Acropolis, to share a sanctuary with Athena, but the goddess had a separate temple of her own hard by. At the other extremity of the Attic land, the shrine of the goddesses of Eleusis had likewise been destroyed by the barbarians. The rebuilding had been soon begun, but like the new temple of Athena on the Acropolis, the work had been discontinued owing to the claims of war on the revenue of the state. Under Pericles it was taken up again and completed. Ictinus made the design, and Coroebus carried it out. The new Hall of Mysteries was built of the dark stone of Eleusis. One side of it was formed by the rock of the hill under which it was built, and the stone steps around the walls would have seated about 3,000. As the place was close to the Megarian frontier, a strong wall with towers was erected round the precincts of the shrine, so that the place had the aspect of a fortress. These splendid buildings required a large outlay of money, and thus gave the political opponents of Pericles a welcome handle against him. Thucydides was the leader of the outcry. He accused Pericles not merely of squandering the resources of the state, which ought to be kept as a reserve for war, but of misappropriating the money of the confederacy for purely Athenian purposes. Athens, it was said, was like a vain woman, adorning herself with pendants of precious stones and statues and temples that cost 1,000 talents. It is certainly true that some money was taken from the treasury of the Hellenotemiae for the new buildings, but this was only a very small part of the cost, which was mainly defrayed by the treasury of Athena and by the public treasury of Athens. There was, however, a good case against Pericles both on grounds of policy and on grounds of justice. The plea for taking a part of the tribute, perhaps a 60th, besides the 60th which was consecrated to Athena, doubtless was that the restoration of Greek temples destroyed by the Persians was a duty which devolved upon all the Greeks. But Pericles, with bold sophistry, argued that the allies had no reason to complain, so long as Athens defended them efficiently. This was the contract, and they had no right to interfere in her disposition of the funds. 3 years after the 30 Years' Peace, Thucydides thought that he could bring the question to an issue, and he asked the people to adjudicate by the sherd. But the people voted for the ostracism of Thucydides, and henceforward Pericles had no opponent of influence to thwart his policy or cross his way. The buildings already begun could now be continued without criticism, and new works could be undertaken. A great hall of music, or Odeon, intended for the musical contests which had recently been added to the Panathenaic celebrations, was now erected on the east side of the theatre of Dionysus. Its roof, made of the masts and yard-arms of captured Persian ships, was pointed like a tent, and wits compared it to the helmet of Pericles the Strategos. "The trial by sherd is over," says some one in a play which the comic poet Cratinus put on the stage at this time, "so here comes Pericles, our peak-headed Zeus, with the Odeon set on his crown." Though Cimon, when he constructed the southern wall of the Acropolis, also built a new entrance gate facing south-westward, it was too small and unimposing to relieve the frowning aspect of the walled hill. A more worthy approach, worthy of the Parthenon, was devised by the architect Menescles, and met the approbation of Pericles. The buildings designed by Menescles occupied the whole west side of the hill. In the centre, on the brow of the height and facing westward, was to be the entrance with 5 gates, and on either side of this 2 vast columned halls, reaching to the north and south brinks of the hill, in which the Athenians could walk sheltered from sun and rain. Thrown out on the projecting cliffs in front of these halls were to be 2 spacious wings, flanking the ascent to the central gate. But the plan of Menescles took no account of the sanctuaries on the south-western part of the Acropolis, on which his new buildings would encroach. The southern colonnade would have cut short the precinct of Artemis Brauronia, and the adjacent southern wing would have infringed on the enclosure of Athena Nike. On the north side there were no such impediments. The priests of these goddesses raised objections to the execution of the architect's plan at the expense of their sacred precincts, and in consequence the grand idea of Menescles was only partly carried out. But even after the building had begun, Pericles and his architect never abandoned the hope that the scruples of the priests might ultimately be overcome, and while they omitted altogether the southern colonnade, and reduced the proportions of the southern wing, they built in such a way that at some future time the structure might be easily enlarged to the measures of the original design. On the northern side, too, the idea of Menescles was not completed, but for a different reason. The covered colonnade was never built. It was left to the last, and when the time came, Athens was threatened by a great war, and deemed it unwise to undertake any further outlay on building. But the north-western wing was built and was adorned with painting. The greatest paintings that Athens possessed were, however, not on the hill, but in buildings below, and they belonged to a somewhat earlier age. It was Cimon who brought Polygnotus of Thasos to Athens, and it was when Cimon was in power that he, in collaboration with Micon, another eminent painter, decorated with life-size frescoes the new Thasium and the Aniseum on the north side of the Acropolis, and the walls of the painted portico in the market-place. We have already cast a glance at the picture of the Battle of Marathon. The most famous of the pictures of the Thasian master was executed after he had left Athens, for the speech hall of the Cnidians at Delphi. Its subject was the underworld, visited by Odysseus. If it was vain for Athens to hope that Greece would yield her any formal acknowledgment of headship, she might at all events have the triumph of exerting intellectual influence even in the lands which were least ready to admit her claims. And in the field of art she partly fulfilled the ambition of Pericles, who, when he could not make her the queen, desired that she should be the instructress of Hellas. When Phidias had completed the great statue of Athena in gold and ivory, and had seen it set up in the new temple, he went forth, invited by the men of Elis, to make the image for the temple of Zeus at Olympia. For 5 years in his workshop in the Altis the Athenian sculptor wrought at the great chryselephantine god, and the colossal image which came from his hands was probably the highest creation ever achieved by the plastic art of Greece. The Pan-Hellenic god, seated on a lofty throne and clad in a golden robe, held a victory in his right hand and a sceptre in his left. He was bearded, and his hair was wreathed with a branch of olive. Many have borne witness to the impression which the serene aspect of this manifest divinity always produced upon the heart of the beholder. Let a man sick and weary in his soul, who has passed through many distresses and sorrows, whose pillow is unvisited by kindly sleep, stand in front of this image, he will, I deem, forget all the terrors and troubles of human life. An Athenian had wrought, for one of the 2 great centres of Hellenic religion, the most sublime expression of the Greek ideal of godhead. Nor was Phidias the only Athenian artist who worked abroad. We also find the architect Ictinus engaged in designing temples in the Peloponnesus. Section 7. The Piraeus. Growth of Athenian trade. The Piraeus had grown enormously since it had been fortified by Themistocles. It was now one of the great ports and shipping towns in the midst of Hellas, and Pericles took in hand to make it a greater and fairer place. There was one weak point in the common defences of Piraeus and Athens. Between Munychia and the extreme end of the southern wall, which ran down to the strand of Phaleron, there was an unfortified piece of marshy shore, where an enemy might land at night. This defect might have been remedied by building a cross wall, but a wholly different plan was adopted. A new long wall was built, running parallel and close to the northern wall, and like it, joining the fortification of Piraeus with the upper city, as Athens was locally called. The southern or Phaleron wall consequently ceased to be part of the system of defence, and was allowed to fall into disrepair. Round the 3 harbours shipsteads were constructed, in which the vessels could lie high and dry, and on the wharfs and quays new storehouses and buildings of sundry kinds arose for the convenience of shipping and trade. On the east side of the great harbour the chief traffic was carried on in the place of commerce. This mart was marked off by boundary stones, some of which are still preserved, and was subject to the control of a special board of officers. The most famous of the buildings in the place of commerce was the colonnade known as the Deigma, or show place, where merchants showed their wares. But Pericles was not content with the erection of new buildings. The whole town, which crept up the slopes of Munychia from the quays of the great harbour, was laid out on a completely new system, which created considerable interest in Greece. It was the rectangular system, on which the main streets run parallel and are cut by cross streets at right angles. The Piraeus was the first town in Europe where this plan was adopted, which we now see carried out on a large scale in many modern cities. The idea was due to Hippodamus, an architect of Miletus, a man of a speculative as well as practical turn, who tried with less success to apply his principles of symmetry to politics, and sketched the scheme of a model state whose institutions were as precisely correlated as the streets of his model town. The increase of Athenian trade was largely due to the decline of the merchant cities of Ionia, as well as to the blow which was struck to the Phoenician commerce by the victory of Greece over Persia. The decay of Ionian commerce is strikingly reflected in the tribute records of the Athenian confederacy, where the small sums paid by the Ionians are contrasted with the large tributes of the cities on the shores of the Propontis. Lampsacus contributes twice as much as Ephesus. Both trade and industry migrated from the eastern to western and northern shores of the Aegean, and this charge coincided with the rise of her empire. It was Athens that it chiefly profited. The population of Athens and her harbour multiplied, and about this time the whole number of the inhabitants of Attica seemed to have been about 250,000, perhaps more than twice as large as the population of the Corinthian state. But nearly half of these inhabitants were slaves, for one consequence of the growth of manufactures was the inflowing of slave hands into the manufacturing towns. In towns where the people subsisted on the fruits of agriculture, the demand for slaves remained small. It should be observed that although Greece, and especially Athens, consumed large quantities of corn brought from beyond the seas, this did not ruin the agriculture of Greece. The costs of transport were so great that home-grown corn could still be profitable. Except in remote or unusually conservative regions, money had now entirely displaced more primitive standards of exchange and valuation. Most Greek states of any size issued their own coins, and their money at this time was in almost all cases silver. Silver had become plentiful, and prices had necessarily gone up. Thus the price of barley and wheat had become 2 or 3 times dearer than 100 years before. Far more remarkable was the increase in the price of stock. In the days of Solon a sheep could be bought for a drachma. In the days of Pericles its cost might approach 50 drachmae. As money was cheap, interest should have been low, but mercantile enterprise was so active, the demand for capital so great, and security so inadequate, that the usual price of a loan was 12%. End of Chapter 9, Part 7. Recording by Kalinda in Raymond, New Hampshire, on February 6, 2008.